We've got more on Igor Shesterkin and his refusal to sign a record-breaking contract with the New York Rangers. We compare Igor to some other elite goalies from around the NHL. Plus, the Rangers start their season tonight against the Pittsburgh Penguins.
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1157 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And that intro song is Leave the Lights On from our good friends in Passafire. You can check those guys out anywhere you get your music. So big day today, obviously, the NHL getting underway last night. You know, I know the Devils and the Sabres played those two games overseas, but for all intents and purposes, last night really the kickoff of the NHL season proper, and it's going to be continuing tonight. And obviously, Rangers, one of the teams that's going to be in action going on the road to Pittsburgh to play the Penguins. I'm going to have some thoughts on that a little bit later in today's episode, including a surprising bit of news from Ranger practice. A kind of surprising player is going to reportedly be a healthy scratch tonight. We will get to that in due time, but I feel like we have to talk a little bit more about Igor Shesterkin. Now, if you want my initial thoughts on Igor and the idea of whether or not he's being selfish by not signing this long-term contract with the New York Rangers, this record-breaking contract with the New York Rangers, then you can go back to yesterday's episode. We're going to continue talking about that a little bit here today. And we're also going to have your comments because a lot of people in the YouTube section from our previous episode have certainly weighed in. A lot of people saying, pay Igor. A lot of people saying, let him walk, all this stuff, pretty much everything in between. A lot of interesting comments, a lot of interesting takes from you guys. And we're going to be getting to that in just a little bit. Now, a quick programming note. Originally today, we were going to be reading all of your stories that you've sent in from the Rangers playoff run last year, stories from any of the overtime wins that the Rangers got. We're going to push that back a little ways, probably into next week. We will get to that eventually. Definitely looking forward to that episode. But with everything going on with Igor, just felt like we had to talk more about the Ranger netminder here today. So first of all, one thing that I didn't really get a chance to do in yesterday's episode that I wanted to get to today as it pertains to Igor Shesterkin and him turning down the Rangers contract offer. I wanted to go ahead and compare him to some of the other elite goalies from around the NHL and just kind of take a look at their stats side by side and what kind of contracts do those goalies have, and is Igor justified to ask for significantly more than basically any other goalie in the NHL, just about any other goalie in the league. So let's start with Igor, currently 28 years old. 213 career games in the regular season, a 243 goals against average, a 921 save percentage. Last season, a 912 save percentage, and a 258 goals against average. And of course, the one Vezina win as well. And those are the stats we're basically going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at, save percentage, how old are all these goalies, goals against average, and we'll specifically hone in on what they did last year. And I realize there's a million different ways you can look at different goalies. There's other factors, what kind of team defense is played in front of these goalies, and, expected goals against average relative to 60 minutes played and blah, blah, blah. All those stats like that. There's a bunch of different stats you can look at, but for the most part, that's what we're going to be going with. I get the feeling that any of these hearings or contract negotiations, these are the ones that probably get brought up the most. So those are Igor stats. Let's take a look at some other interesting names and some other, elite or semi-elite goalies from around the NHL. We'll start with Jeremy Swayman. Things were getting ugly between him and the Bruins, and ultimately they did come to an agreement on a new contract. Swayman signs 8 years at $8.25 million a season. Swayman is 25 years old. So less experienced than Igor, but also younger than Igor. And you can make of that what you will. There's a little bit of give and take there. But 132 games for Jeremy Swayman, a 234 goals against average, and a 919 save percentage. So his goals against average is a little bit better than Igor. The save percentage, it's like 0.002 points worse than Igor. Very comparable numbers thus far in their career. And Swayman coming off a season where he had a league best 933 save percentage and a 215 goals against average. He had Igor easily beat in both those categories last year. And this is a guy that contentious negotiation to be sure, but he did eventually sign the dotted line with the Boston Bruins, and it's at 8 years, $8.25 million per season. Now, if you ask me, who am I taking? Game 7, everything on the line. Do I want Igor Shesterkin or Jeremy Swayman? I'm going to take my guy. I'm going to take Igor Shesterkin. I do think I would go with Igor against just about, any goalie in the NHL right now in a big time, playoff game. And maybe that gets factored into, what these guys have done when it comes to the playoffs. But when you look at all these numbers, when you look at the track record of both Igor and Swayman to date in the NHL, are we looking at a situation where Igor, who I believe wants to be, they've said he wants to be the highest paid Ranger. It sounds like maybe 12 million is the magic number for Igor. I'm not 100% on that, but let's just say 12 million. You got to figure it's somewhere around that ballpark. Is Igor really worth, let's see, that would be $3.75 million per season more than Jeremy Swayman? I have a tough time believing that. And I feel like, for that reason, the Rangers' offer was more than fair. Let's keep it rolling here, though. There's a couple other goalies I want to talk about. Linus Umar, he is now with the Ottawa Senators after being traded there by the Bruins, during this offseason here. And Swayman just signed a new deal, or excuse me, Umar just signed a new deal with the Senators, 4 years at $8.25 million per season. So the same average annual value as his former buddy, Jeremy Swayman, his former teammate, Jeremy Swayman, but for half the length, only 4 years for Linus Ullmark. And you can see why. At 31 years old, he is quite a bit older than, obviously Swayman. He's 6 years older than him. He's 3 years older than Igor. 247 games for Ullmark, a career 251 goals against average, and a .918 save percentage. So the goals against average is extremely comparable to Igor. It's 0.08 worse. And the save percentage is 0.03 worse. So there's barely any difference. Igor does have him beat by just a little bit in each category. Last year, a .915 save percentage for Ullmark and a .257 goals against average. So a very, very slightly better save percentage for Ullmark last year and a very, very, very slightly better goals against average last year. But again, you're talking about a guy who not only at $8.25 million per season is getting far less per season than what Igor wants, but far less length as well, only 4 years. And I realize maybe the age has something to do with it. But Ullmark's 31, Igor's 28. It's a significant enough difference where that can affect things, but it's not like this massive difference. We're not talking about, a 35-year-old against a 25-year-old, which obviously that would come into play quite a bit. But again, comparable goalie, comparable results, especially in the last few years. And, he signed for far fewer years than the Rangers are offering Igor and far less money as well. Let's move on to somebody else. He was going to be a UFA after this season, but not too long ago, I think a couple months back, UC Saros did sign an extension with the Nashville Predators. Now, Saros, he's only 29 years old, and yet he only got a 3-year extension with the Predators, and it will kick in after this season, and it will be worth $7.7 million per year. 350 career games for Saros, a .263 goals against average, and a .917 save percentage. And again, to compare this to Igor Shesterkin, the goals against average is 0.2 worse than Igor Shesterkin. And as for the save percentage, it is 0.04 worse than Igor Shesterkin. So 3 years at 7.74. That's all it took to get UC Saros, signed. He's only a year older than Igor Shesterkin. There's not a massive difference when you look at what these two have done throughout their career in terms of goals against average and save percentage. And yet Saros got 5 years less than the Rangers are offering Igor Shesterkin and more, about $3.25 million less per season than the Rangers offered Igor Shesterkin. So again, you look at these comparisons here, and it's not lining up. You can make the case, and a lot of Ranger fans have made the case, that Igor Shesterkin at 8 years, $11 million, I would have been okay with that. I really would have, because he is an elite goalie. He stepped it up big time in the playoffs. He's our guy, and if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes. The salary cap will go up, a bunch of other factors as well. One of them being that there's not really much of a plan B in place if the Rangers don't have Igor Shesterkin, especially for this upcoming season. But like I've been saying, it can't be a blank check, and that becomes even more true when you compare to some of these other goalies around the league. Connor Hellebuck, one of the absolute best goalies in hockey. I don't think there's anybody that would even come close to denying that. He signed recently with the Jets a 7-year extension at $8.5 million per season. So only a shade higher than both Ullmark and Swayman in terms of average annual value. Once again, they were both at $8.25 million per year. Hellebuck gets $8.5 million per year. Hellebuck is 31 years old, so he is 3 years older than Igor Shesterkin, but 505 games for Hellebuck, a 263 goals against average, a 917 save percentage, and that goals against is only 0.2 worse than Igor, and the save percentage is only 0.04 worse than Igor. And this is somebody that has been doing it for longer than Igor. I mean, I realize that also makes him older, but a longer and more proven track record than Igor Shesterkin, somebody that's very consistent, an elite top 5 goalie seemingly every year. That's something that's very difficult to do. And again, very, very comparable numbers. And when you look at what they did last year, Hellebuck had Igor beat in the two stats that we keep talking about. Hellebuck had a 921 save percentage compared to Igor's 912, and he also had a 239 goals against average compared to Igor's 2.58. I will reiterate what I said yesterday. The Rangers offer is more than fair, and I think that a lot of people would argue, and you can make a strong case for this, the 8 years at $11 million is too much for any goalie, even someone as great and as playoff battle-tested as Igor Shesterkin is. So you guys can draw your own conclusions from that, but that to me is kind of where things stand. And I think that, one more thing I want to mention in this section here, because I want to turn it over to you guys. I want to hear what all the Ranger fans are saying about Igor Shesterkin. We're basically going to spend most of the rest of the episode doing that. But there's one other thing that's come up here, and I'm going to talk more about this a little bit later in the episode, but the idea of trading Igor Shesterkin. For now, I'll just say, no, you can't do it because the Rangers are in a Stanley Cup window. I'll elaborate on that a little bit later when we get to some of your comments. But given the fact that, these negotiations have seemingly hit a standstill, I do think it's at least fair game to bring up the concept of an Igor trade. I'm still wholly against it, and I don't think there's any way the Rangers would do it. But while we're on the subject, something that I did not mention in yesterday's episode that I'll mention now, I didn't think it's something that would ever be relevant, but I guess now it's at least semi-relevant. Igor Shesterkin, for the final year of his contract, does have a limited no trade clause. He can block a trade to any of 10 different NHL teams, which, obviously that doesn't handcuff you if you're the Rangers. If you really want to do this, you could probably find a trade partner. But that's worth at least pointing out there. But again, I do not think the Rangers will do a trade of Igor Shesterkin. I don't think there's any way they should do a trade. And I think it's very likely that they're even considering or even talking to other teams about it. You never know for sure. But like I said, I'll elaborate on that a little bit later in today's episode. In just a minute, we're going to get to some of your comments about the Igor situation. Some people want to pay him. Some people are mad at Igor. We'll get to all that good stuff, like I said, in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That is FanDuel.com. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. Huge shout out to the everydayers as always, for sticking with Locked On Rangers throughout the entire season. We've got Rangers Penguins, really excited for that regular season kicking off. And given that, we had some drama with Trouba, given that now we've got some drama with Igor Shesterkin, I'm ready for the Rangers to take the ice and hopefully start the season 1-0. Obviously, there's no love lost between those two teams. We'll see how everything goes. But Rangers starting the regular season tonight. It feels a little surreal right now, and I don't know that I'll really believe it until, the puck drops and I'm sitting there watching it. But just absolutely cannot wait for the puck drop a little bit later here tonight. But I want to shift our attention to some of the comments that you guys have made about Igor Shesterkin. I'm also going to have a couple of notes on the Rangers-Penguins game at the end of today's episode as well. So, like I said, spirited YouTube section from the episode that we posted yesterday. A lot of people have a lot of different opinions. I'm just going to go through a couple of them. There is a comment here that says, if New York Rangers haven't extended Igor by the deadline, do they risk a Tavares situation? And this individual is referencing, obviously Tavares not re-signing with the Islanders. I think a lot of people thought that he would. Instead, he goes home, goes to Toronto, signs a big money contract there, is named the captain of the Leafs, and the Islanders got nothing for him. I don't think that the Rangers will even consider trading Igor Shesterkin now, in season, or at the trade deadline. I suppose crazier things have happened, but here's the thing. You are right now, if you're the New York Rangers, you are trying to win a Stanley Cup, and that should be the mission statement. Every single player on that team, that should be the expectation. That should be the goal coming into the season. They've been knocking on the door, 3 straight strong seasons in a row. 2 out of the last 3 years saw them go to the Eastern Conference Final. 2 wins shy from going to the Stanley Cup final. And this past year, you could make the case that the Panthers were the only team that was going to beat the Rangers in a best-of-7 series. That's at least possible. What would have happened between the Rangers and the Oilers? I don't know. What would have happened between the Rangers and the Stars? I don't know that either, or any of these other teams that the Rangers didn't play in the playoffs, but you can at least make that case. As far as, trading Igor, because I think that's what this individual is getting at here, it would be different now during the season and at the trade deadline. It would be different if the Rangers were this bottom of the barrel team and they're a long shot to even make the playoffs, much less compete for the Stanley Cup championship. But that's not the case. If that was the case and the Rangers were looking at a lengthy rebuild, then yes, I would be working the phones if I'm Chris Drury. I'd be trying to start a bidding war of some kind. If you can't get this guy under contract and your team is bottom of the barrel anyway, then yes, by all means, bring in all the assets that you can. But the Rangers are not in that situation. The Rangers are a bona fide Stanley Cup contender. There's people that'll fight me on this, but you will never get me to agree that a team that has the best record in the NHL, makes it to the Eastern Conference Final, is one of the last 4 teams standing, that team has no chance of winning a Stanley Cup. They might not win the Stanley Cup, but as I've said all along, the number one reason for the Rangers or anybody else not winning the Stanley Cup is that there can only be one champion out of 32 teams, and it's an extraordinarily difficult championship to win. With all that said, no, I don't think there's any chance that the Rangers trade Igor. Now, as far as will it turn out like the Tavares situation? It could. It's possible that he leaves for nothing. But again, you're not in a position if you're the Rangers to be able to trade Igor Shesterkin and then also think that you're going to compete for a Stanley Cup championship this year. Greg responded to something that I said in yesterday's episode. I listed some of the UFA goalies that will be available after this upcoming season. This is what Greg had to say. From that list, I would want Umar first, Adin Hill second, no to the retread Georgiev. He left this comment before Umar signed his extension with the Senators. From that list, yeah, I mean, Umar, I might put Hill number 1. It's a little bit of a leap of faith, but he is a Stanley Cup winning goalie, and he had a nice season last year as well. Georgiev, I'm not really feeling either. I can't really put my finger on it. It's certainly an option, but he is coming off of a down season with the Avalanche, and I don't know. It just felt like it didn't really end that great between him and the Rangers. He always wanted to be the guy, and then Igor took it away from him. I just get that feeling Georgiev himself might look to go elsewhere. AJ says, let him walk and re-sign Georgie. We got another Georgie fan here. No goalie is worth $11 million per year over 8 years. That, to me, is about my ceiling. And in some ways, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, we, instead of being so fixated on the number and how much money he's going to make per season, we should be looking more at the percentage of the salary cap that Igor Shesterkin is going to take. And I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit later in today's episode. So we'll get to that in due time. Another comment here. It's not going to work with Igor. Once this team's opportunity is up, which will probably be this year, what are you going to do with a $12.5 million goalie that you can't afford to build around? So I got to disagree. This is something that I've talked about as far as this being the last chance for this Ranger team. I don't buy that for 2 seconds. A stat that I've gone back to a couple times, I'll repeat it here. The Rangers are projected, and the season has started now, but going into the season, the Rangers were projected to be the 9th youngest team in the NHL. And among the 16 playoff teams last year, second youngest only to the Boston Bruins. And even that was only by a whisker. The Bruins were just slightly younger than the Rangers. So I don't buy this idea that this is their last chance. And as far as building around a $12.5 million goalie, I mean, look, that does take out a big chunk of the salary cap. So your concerns there are certainly valid. But one thing you got to remember is that not after this year, but the season after that, Trouba and Panarin are both free agents. And that's going to create almost $20 million in cap space. So, yeah, I mean, you're paying Igor a lot. It is somewhat detrimental to the team, but you're also going to have a lot of salary cap space you can play with there as well. I don't think Trouba will even be a Ranger for that long. But if he is, he'll come off the books no later than that offseason. We've got a comment here from Dean. Dean says, Joey Decord is the best of the names you mentioned. The truth is the goalies were underpaid in the past in relation to the best players. I understand both sides and do love the Rangers and Igor. I do believe he is truly the best Ranger. And keep in mind, they had Igor on a deal on the first contract. Yeah, that's definitely, the last part of that is definitely something that I have not forgotten. That could even be a little bit of what's causing a little bit of friction here. From the Rangers' perspective, because if you remember, we'll go back in time 3 years. The Rangers signed Igor Shesterkin to a 4-year deal worth I'm trying to remember what it was now. I think it's $5.67 million a season. That's in the ballpark. It's right around that number. So from the Rangers' perspective, Drury and everybody else in the front office, they might look at this situation and that past contract and say, look, man, we stuck your neck out for you. You had not had a lot of NHL experience, and we took that leap of faith on you, and we gave you more money at that time than any goalie had ever had that had played as few games in the NHL as you did. So the Rangers might have felt like they did Igor a solid, but the other side of that, Igor might look at that and says, look, man, I've been underpaid. I've been vastly underpaid for 4 years now. And yeah, you signed me to that contract, but I've long since eclipsed that number. And he's not wrong about that, if that's the way that Igor Shesterkin feels. So that could be something that's causing a little bit of friction here as well. The Rangers felt like they did Igor a solid. Igor feels like he did the Rangers a solid. And they can both be right about that too, because it was a leap of faith by Drury. But then Igor, after signing that extension, vastly outplayed his average annual value. So both those things can be true. And as far as your comment on Joey Daccord, yeah, to me, he's kind of like the dark horse, like under the radar. Maybe it's like the West Coast thing. I'm not really sure. But Daccord had a heck of a season last year for the Kraken. It was his first season as a starter, and he was just kind of a meh goalie before that. Had never really been a starter. So I'll be very curious to see what he does this year. He'll be a free agent after the year if he doesn't sign any kind of an extension with the Kraken, and somebody that I think will have an interesting market, whether the Rangers are talking to him or somebody else is. And regardless, I still, despite everything that we're saying on here, I want something to get done between the Rangers and Igor Shesterkin. And I do hope that happens, and I do hope that it's a reasonable cost. GTRX man says, let him walk. Rangers didn't win with him in net. Paying him another $5.3 million isn't going to change anything. Trade him for some offensive firepower. If Vegas can win with Hill and Edmonton can go to 7 games with Skinner, then Domingue and Quick can carry the Rangers. So you've said some things that I definitely agree with. You've said some things that I definitely do not agree with. Let's start with the idea of other goalies, kind of unheralded goalies, because I do agree with this, and there is something to be said for this. Unheralded goalies making a run, making a deep run in the playoffs. In the case of Adin Hill, winning the Stanley Cup. That's the last 2 years here. And for the people that say that the goalie position is, overrated and overblown, and you need to just have a solid goalie that doesn't cost an arm and a leg, that's certainly a feather in the cap of GTRX man here and anybody else that feels that way. Yeah, I mean, Hill was an unheralded goalie when he won the Stanley Cup, did a heck of a job for them. And Skinner, I don't even think he was the starting goalie for the Oilers when this past season began. And obviously he played very well. Now, it must be said, he did not win the Stanley Cup. He got them very close. But I know that some people will always point to the fact that the Rangers never won the Stanley Cup with Lundqvist. So if we're going to do that, then we have to be fair here and look at Skinner and say, yeah, but they didn't win it. So I agree somewhat with what you're saying there, that there's two schools of thought. You can have an elite goalie and win the cup that way. We've seen teams do that. Sergei Bobrovsky this past year. Obviously Jonathan Quick, all the Stanley Cups that he won. Marty Brodeur all those years, Patrick Waugh, the list goes on and on. But then there's also some unheralded goalies that win it as well. As far as like the idea that paying him $5.3 million isn't going to change anything, not on the surface, but I've talked about this before in the past too. We've seen a lot of examples of teams around the NHL that were knocking on the door. Couldn't quite kick the door down, couldn't quite win the Stanley Cup until they did. The Caps, I think, are a great example of that. You look at Tampa Bay. Everybody thought that they had to blow everything up when they got swept by Columbus. They won the next 2 Stanley Cups and then even made the Stanley Cup final for a third year. The year after that, they're another great example of that. The Knights, ever since they came into existence, they've been close and they can't get over the hump and they can't win it. And then they won it. And, even the Panthers to an extent, I mean, they had gotten swept by the Lightning the year that they won the President's Trophy. They had obviously made the finals the year before this one. So they were knocking on the door for a little while as well. And the Avalanche were a team that have all these superstar players and they couldn't get past even the second round. And then they won the Stanley Cup. So it doesn't mean it's going to happen for the Rangers. It doesn't guarantee that, but to act like, oh, it's never going to happen, it's a little premature to make that declaration as well. And the other part of this that I have to disagree with, Domingue and Quick can carry the Rangers. No, they can't. I'm usually somebody that always says, don't bet against a legend. And that's why I like the Jonathan Quick signing last offseason a little bit more than most Ranger fans did. And I love the fact that they re-signed him and brought him back for another year here. Quick was basically left for dead before this last season. Everybody thought he was over the hill. Everybody thought that he was done. And as well as he played, and as much as I still think he's going to be a valuable player to this team, he's going to be 39 years old in January. It's hard to, hitch the wagon to Jonathan Quick at this point. And I say this as a big Jonathan Quick fan, and again, somebody that's very happy that he's still here. And Louis Domingue, bro, listen, Domingue has played a total of 4 regular season games over the past 4 seasons. there's a reason for that. Now, he did well. He played one game for the Rangers, had a nice night. Great. He's had, put up pretty good numbers in the AHL as well. You can't go from Igor Shesterkin to Louis Domingue and just act like, oh, it's fine, whatever, who cares? We'll win a Stanley Cup. You just can't. So I'm sorry, but cannot agree with that part of your statement. Going to keep everything rolling in just a second here. More of your comments on Igor Shesterkin. Also some news from the Rangers and Penguins game a little bit later here tonight. And we're going to do all that fun stuff in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even faster and even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so that you do not have to waste time searching through thousands and thousands of tickets. You've got Gametime Picks. Curation makes it easier to save more on sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc., all in pricing. Toggling this feature shows the total upfront with no surprise fees at checkout. Seat views. Get a panoramic view of your seat in the app before you buy. That is an absolutely awesome feature that I have used on multiple occasions. You've got the lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. And Gametime ticket coverage. Your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? It is game time. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here. Figure we can close out today's episode with a few more comments from you guys, and then also a little bit of news on tonight's game between the Rangers and the Penguins. By the way, lost in all the Igor drama. Yeah, the Rangers play hockey tonight. Cannot wait for that, as I said. This one comes to us from Ray Tapia on YouTube. This first sentence makes me laugh. Rejecting $88 million is absolutely diabolical work. Do I think Igor is a great goalie? Yes. Do I have the same fan favorite energy for him? Not too sure. First of all, $12 million will ruin the cap room, let alone who's going to pay that in the NHL, not Stanley Cup contenders. They have enough on their own plate. So only teams that can pay that is maybe Philly, Chicago, if he wants to be on a team with a big payday. And yeah, that's something else that I'm going to look into, because we're going to be talking about Igor on and off all season. I can give you guys a preview that this is going to come up every so often. The idea of him signing a contract extension. Obviously, if he ultimately does sign one, we'll talk about that. But this is going to be a storyline until it's not, until something gives, until something happens. But as far as the teams you mentioned, yeah, Chicago, my understanding is they have a boatload of cap space, which makes sense. They're in deep rebuild. Haven't looked at Philly. I know the Sharks have a ton of cap space as well. So it's possible that one of those teams could make a competitive offer for Igor Shesterkin if we get to unrestricted free agency and he still is not signed at the end of this season. But to your point, these are not good teams, not even close. Now, can one of them maybe rebuild kind of quickly, kind of rapidly? The Sharks have Celebrini that they can build around now. You never know. And obviously, landing Igor Shesterkin, that would accelerate the rebuild for any of these teams. But, man, you're going from one of the best teams in the NHL to one of the worst if you sign with one of these teams. And you're going to get less support. You'll have less of a chance to win a championship. Now, again, maybe Igor doesn't care. Maybe it really is just all about the money. I don't want to rule that out either. But, yeah, I mean, I don't see any team. And you got to keep in mind, this is important too. The Rangers went to 8 years. They're the only team that can do that for Igor Shesterkin. Per the rules that the NHL has in place when it comes to free agents, only the player's current team can sign him for 8 years, and that's the maximum. Every other team around the NHL can only go to 7 years. So for anybody to match, I did this math yesterday, for anybody to match the total value of Igor's contract, they can only go to 7 years. They would have to pay him about $12.5 million per season, as opposed to the Rangers' $11 million per season, in order to get to the same final total of $88 million over the length of the contract. I just don't know that any team is going to do that. Now, granted, it only takes one team, a team desperate enough, a team that says, we have everything we need. The only thing we're missing is a goalie. Maybe a team like that makes a run at Igor. But even like saying that out loud now, you realize that like if a team is that good, they're probably pretty uptight against the salary cap, and they're not going to have room to pay that kind of a money to anybody, let alone a goalie. So yeah, that's kind of where things stand there. I just don't know, how many teams are even going to think about going that high for Igor Shesterkin. But like I said before, all it takes is one, and you never know what can happen if this thing goes all the way out to free agency next year. Sean Lewin says, it's like I've been saying, his value is way inflated at the moment. Let's play the season, and his price will have to drop. we all should have known this would happen. I'm not worried. Yeah, I do think that if the Rangers really dig in here and really play hardball, that they might get Igor to eventually sign a contract for essentially the same amount of years and dollars that they've already offered him. Maybe you have to go up a little bit. You throw him a little bit of a bone. You say, okay, $11.25 million per season, something like that. Maybe that gets it done. But to your point, I don't think that anybody is going to go really much higher than what the Rangers offered him. And again, even if they do, they can only go to 7 years. The one thing, though, I have to say that I don't think Igor's value is really inflated right now. The idea that, his value will be down after the season, the only way that happens is if he has a down year, and I just don't think that's going to happen with Igor Shesterkin. It's possible the price will still come down because he just doesn't get the offers that he thinks he's going to get, but I don't think it'll be for the reason that, well, his value is inflated now and it'll be less at the end of the season. Let's see. We got time for a couple others here. All right. So there's been a lot of Igor bashing. Let's go to somebody that has something positive to say here. John Harmon says, boy, lots of hate in the comments. I think as fans, we forget that he isn't a Rangers fan like we are. He is a professional athlete trying to make the most money he can for his skill set, the same way you do at your job, I hope. It does feel like he's being unrealistic with what he wants, so I agree with that. But acting shocked like he's supposed to be Rangers loyal like a fan is just silly. Yeah, look, I've said, two things can be true at once here. You can look at this as a fan and be upset and be angry and think that this is more than fair from the Rangers. That's how I feel. It's okay. I think if you're a little bit frustrated with the situation, if you're a little bit upset at Igor Shesterkin, I think that's fair. But to John's point here, yeah, this is a business. And I said this in the last episode as well. Igor Shesterkin, to me, sign the contract. That's kind of my feeling right here. But he's under no obligation to do so. He is 100% within his right to play hardball here, to let things play out this season, to make it to unrestricted free agency, and to see what's out there at the end of the year. I feel like that offer that the Rangers gave him should be more than enough. But, Igor doesn't have to have this undying loyalty to the Rangers. They're just the team that drafted him. I have no idea. Who is Igor Shesterkin's favorite NHL team before he was drafted by the Rangers? Did he have a favorite NHL team? Does he not care? They're different than we are because we're Ranger fans, and a lot of us have been Ranger fans for a long time, and we bleed, Ranger blue, and that's great and everything. But Igor doesn't have to be that way. He's allowed to, to have other things factor into his decision and which team that he eventually wants to play for. So I figure, let's see, we got time for. We'll do one more here. There was a funny one at the end of the episode that I want to go to here. So actually, there are two. Tall, Gray, and Gruesome says, I don't have a good feeling about this season starting out. The greedy one in goal and the problem child on defense. Hopefully, as the long season progresses, things will smooth out. Yeah, man, only the Rangers can, at the start of the offseason and at the end of the offseason, have two completely different high-drama storylines going on. And this being in the season, it's not like they had a bad season. This is coming off a season where they won the President's Trophy. Only the Rangers. Also, we've got a comment from Can't Find Waldo. Maybe he wants to sign for less to help the team. I'm delusional. Yeah, I can promise you that's not what's holding things up here, but that is pretty funny. Imagine the Rangers are trying to give him all this money. He's like, no, man, I want to help the team. I want to take less. Yeah, that's not what's going on, unfortunately. To wrap up today's episode, did just want to mention, I mentioned at the top of the show, a little bit of a surprise as far as the Ranger opening night lineup. Surprise healthy scratch. Matt Rempe right now is not going to be playing in the opener. Unless anything changes between now and the puck drop, your fourth line from left to right on opening night will be Adam Edstrom, Sam Carrick, and Johnny Brodzinski. I personally would have Carrick as the odd man out, but it seems like the Rangers are digging in there. It seems like of everybody I just mentioned, he was probably in the least amount of danger of being a healthy scratch for this first game. But I am happy that Edstrom's in there, and that's cool. And I like Brodzinski, high hustle, high motor player. I would have Rempe in there, though. I would have Rempe in there, preferably over Carrick. But even if it came down to Brodzinski versus Rempe, I'd go with Rempe there. And the ultimate test there, ask the Penguins. Who do they want to be in the lineup for the Rangers? Brodzinski or Rempe? They're probably going to pick Brodzinski. And Brodzinski had a good camp, not taking anything away. 4 points in 4 preseason games, and that's all well and good. But yeah, for one night at least, the Rempe Maniacs are not going to get their wish. He will be a healthy scratch. But figure we can call it there for today. Ranger hockey tonight. Let's go get it. Let's start 1-0. If you guys would like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well, @LO_NY_Rangers. Once again, that's @LO_NY_Rangers. And definitely subscribe to Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.